Okay, well, thank you. Hi, everyone. Some of you I know, and many of you I don't. I'm relatively new to Beacon. So thank you so much for signing up. I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk about both genealogy and the fundamentals of genealogy, but I'm also going to speak a little bit about oral history. And one of my favorite quotes is by a Jamaican poet. His name is Key Miller. Draw me a map of what you see, then I will draw a map of what you never see. And guess whose map will be bigger than whose? So I think it's intuitive, but there's all the stuff that we can get from a family tree. But then hand in hand with that, there's all of our family stories. And those family stories really are the glue that hold the generations and the family together. So for me, both are equally important. Some folks are very lucky, and there is a treasure trove of stuff that they have passed down through the generations. Some of us, we have to search and search and search online and can find some interesting stuff. But those stories are also really important to capture. So I'm going to go through this with some basic standards of how to research and some fundamentals of research. And then I'm also going to share a whole bunch of resources. There are literally tens of thousands of resources online. And so I'm just picked a few that I have found especially useful in unblocking when I get stuck. That's kind of how I approached it. So as a kid, I guess I had just turned 9 years old, and we had a bad thing happen in my family. And my father's older sister, my Aunt Hester, came to stay with us for a while. And my dad was hospitalized for quite a while. And every morning before school, my aunt would just tell me all kinds of family stories. And I was just a sponge with loving these family stories. I never met my father's parents, my grandparents, and they were Irish immigrants. And so my aunt, my dad's generation, they were first generation Americans. And I came to understand through the years how many things that I thought were true were really just influenced by the Irish stories and superstitions and all those things that my aunt had shared with me that were, her beliefs and family stories and growing up. But then around 5th grade, I had a school project, which we had to do a timeline of our lives. Mind you, I'm 10 years old. And then we also had to do a family tree. So I had enough knowledge based on everything my Aunt Hester had shared to do that side of the family. And then I reached out on my mother's side. And a cousin of my mother's sent me a document, and it dated back to 1620 in the United States. And that was, I could not understand it. I couldn't grasp it. I mean, I was young, but that started for me a real love of history and of the factual part of history and where people lived and what what kind of property they owned. The other thing that really struck me and still strikes me is when you find the list of people's possessions from the 16, 17, 1800s, and it's, 1 goat, 1 chicken, 6 petticoats, 7 under petticoats. And it's just so, to me, it's just absolutely fascinating stuff. And to me, it always led to more and more questions. And for me, there's always been a sense of mystery about all of my family. Then, I went to school, went to college. I became a senior level behavioral health care executive, worked in the nonprofit world for many years, a little bit of for-profit time. And of course, I was working all the time. So this sort of went on the back burner. And then around 2008, I started working, I took a job with a for-profit, and they were using me as a troubleshooter. So things would come in waves. So I had some time, which was very, very cool. And I started to pursue my education in genealogy, but also in oral history work. And through word of mouth and whatnot, I was introduced to a man who was 95 years old at the time, and he wanted someone to record his life story. So I went and I met with him once a week for an entire summer. He was a fascinating man. We would meet for about 3 hours at a time. He says to me at the beginning, he says, I'm going to do this with you, but if you make me uncomfortable with any of your questions, we're going to stop. And I assured him I was there as a recorder. I was there to record his story, what he wanted to share. This was about his life, not me, not my life. I was not a part of this. Unfortunately, in the middle of the project, he got very sick and he passed away. So, and at this point, I had met some members of his family, and I had been able to do for him a lot of research online, thanks to Google, and bring up lots of images of things that to him were just still memories in his head, visual memories. But I was able to bring up lots of photographs, and so the process was very good, I thought. Well, I finished what I had, which came pretty far forward into the present. And then I never heard anything from his family. So I was very disappointed, and I was afraid I had missed the mark. Then about 5 years later, his daughter called me out of the blue. And she said that because she had just been so upset when her dad died, she had never read it, but that she had just taken the time to read what I had compiled for them. And it was like maybe yay thick. And she says to me, best compliment I've ever gotten in my life. She says, you know what? You got him, and he didn't want to be got. So I was absolutely hooked. So from there, again, I joined the oral history. It was an association. And then this past year, I started taking courses at Boston University in genealogy. So, and then I should just also mention one other thing. In 2013, my cousins and I, on my father's side, we all took a trip over to Northern Ireland, where our parents are from. And my one cousin had done a lot of work. So we were able to have a family reunion of sorts, not really reunion, but a union, and meet lots and lots of people that we, we never had a relationship with, because when my grandparents left Ireland, they never went back. And most societies are much older than the United States. So you will find records are kept back so far. In the town square, you have the war memorial, and there were my grandmother's brothers, and fast forward, and from World War I, and just, we went to the church where she was baptized, and we saw her baptismal record. Although there are still some mysteries there. There's a lot of mysteries, and I'll talk about that when I talk about discrepancies. So Boston University offers a nice genealogy program. So I've begun that, and I will likely pursue certification. I'm not 100% sure I'll do it there, but I do recommend the program for the scope of knowledge and work that you can learn. The only thing is it's completely online. There is no interaction. And so that's just not necessarily my best learning style, but there are a lot of resources out there. So I'm going to ask, I can't see everybody at once, but are most of you involved already with searching your family genealogies or family histories? Okay. So there's a lot of online resources, and you know what? I'm going to bump ahead and then we'll come back. So there's a whole lot of stuff available online. So you've got subscription web-based stuff, which is the ones you probably have heard of, like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, MyHeritage. Those, so they're good resources. Then there is a free web-based tool. You just have to create an account, but it's entirely free. It's familysearch.org. It's run by the Mormon Church out of Utah. It is the largest searchable database in the world. It's got 3.5 billion names and 1,500 record collections. And record collections means things like your census, whether it's by the country or by the state. It's got marriage records. It's got land records. It's got just, I can't even list them, though I will try. You've got the military records, draft cards, draft records, discharge paperwork. You've got wills and death records and estate information. You've got a lot of court documents, records of baptisms, adoption records, applications for citizenship, which are fascinating to read because they're filled out by your ancestor, so it's pretty interesting. Divorce records. You can also find things like if you know a relative worked for, say, DuPont, you can search a database of old DuPont newsletters. And I was doing that one day, and sure enough, my grandfather was a painter with DuPont. Sure enough, there was a photo of him used in some marketing campaign. So I mean, you just, once you begin searching, it's a giant spider web, and you're going to find one thing's going to lead you to another thing and another thing and another thing. I do recommend that when you do this, maybe set a timer for how much time you want to dedicate, because really there's just so much available and you can just go and go and go. Immigration records, such as passenger manifests. Ellis Island has an online database. It just goes on and on and on how many databases there are. That you can find databases specific to countries other than the United States. You can find, different universities have different collections. Stockton University here in South Jersey has an interesting collection of information related to the Jewish population of New Jersey, southern New Jersey. Hampshire College has an interesting collection of Yiddish, sort of Yiddish documents written in Yiddish, translation services. It's pretty interesting what you can find out there. The Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, is really incredible in terms of everything they collect and they offer. So they had all paper records sort of built into this cave. I don't even know how to explain it. And they've digitized everything. So I do recommend, especially if you haven't begun, you might want to start with Family Search and see where you get, because it's free and there's an abundant amount of information on there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the record collections because that's really key. There's some other resources that I recommend, and these are actually books, but they're really, really useful. So, and I'm going to talk a minute in the difference between traditional genealogy and genetic genealogy. And that also gets into the resources that I've put up there. So this book, I don't know if you can see it, but it's the Everything Guide to Online Genealogy. So this is a good synopsis, not just of resources, but of what you're reading, how to read it, how to interpret things, because no matter how much you try, you're going to find discrepancies. There just always are. Names can be spelled differently. Names can be spelled a little differently. Census records used to all be written by hand, so sometimes it's just even hard to read. I was going to do a screenshot, and if we had longer, I would pull up some census records to show you what I mean by that and to show you everything you can find on there. The other book that's really good, The Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing, is really, really interesting because so we all have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, one we got from our mom, one we got from our dad. The way that the X chromosome goes through the generations is different than the Y chromosome. And it can help explain variations in your DNA results if you choose to go that route. And it can also help you understand why you can have someone as a cousin you can have two cousins, same side of the family, but one, your percentage of shared DNA is much less than another cousin. So so genetics is really important. And then, or I should say context is really important more than genetics, because you could, of course, take it, you could have a whole degree on genetics. And then this book I also included, which is Genealogy Standards. This I included in case any of you are interested in pursuing your family trees and you ever thought about hiring a professional genealogist. These are the standards that board certified genealogists are required to follow. And it would be really important when you hire someone to know that they're doing that and what you're buying, so that you can be as sure as possible that the results that you're getting are accurate, because you don't want to perpetuate errors in your family trees. There's two sites, Cindy's List and genealogy.com, that are really good with lists, and they're mostly free. They're .coms, but they're free. They can give you lots of lists, and a number of sites can. If you want to meet with your relatives, you want to meet with family members, and you're not quite sure how to guide a conversation, and you can do this yourself. You don't necessarily have to hire someone. But you can, it's just a good resource for some questions, especially if you've not done this before. I'm a social worker by background, so interviewing is sort of something I do, not for hiring, but for people and individuals. So I'm accustomed to that, but if you're not accustomed to that, it can be really helpful. The other thing is, down in Washington, D.C., the Holocaust Museum has a treasure trove of educational resources for conducting interviews. It doesn't necessarily have to be that your family member went through the Holocaust. They're just good framework questions for doing interviews. So now I'm going to go back, and I want to talk about the difference between genetic genealogy and traditional genealogy. So genetic genealogy is just that. It's based on your DNA. So Ancestry, 23andMe, the way they work, so they're subscription based. You can also just pay a one-time fee and get your initial results, or they have different packages you can purchase. But these are genetic genealogy sites. You give a sample of your saliva. I'm gonna guess many of you have done this. You give a sample of your saliva, you send it to them, and then you start getting results. So as of 2015, each site had tested 1 million people. That was 2015, nearly 10 years ago. Their database just keeps growing. So what happens is you're going to get your initial results, and then you're going to see over time things get modified. So I started out, I don't know, I started out like 40-some% Irish and the rest was Scottish. And now I'm less than 10% Irish. I'm 69% Scottish, and then a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And it's just because their database keeps growing. So they keep comparing results against the database to refine more and more and more. Same thing with 23andMe and MyHeritage. The packages that you can then go on to get. So what I get now is I get email notifications that'll say you have a new match. And I can look it up. I can see the percentage of shared DNA. I can see which parent it came from. I can compare the ethnicity estimate of the person that's been the hit and my ethnicity is estimate. So that also, again, you're forming an entire picture when you do your family tree. So the first thing I say is pack your patience. And it can be a very frustrating search. With the familysearch.org, that's more traditional genealogy. Okay, so that's going to include everyone in your family, the in-laws, the people that married in, it's everybody. The first set, the genetic genealogy, which what I find now that I do is I started with Ancestry, but now I've moved over to Family Search because Ancestry just keeps raising their prices as well. But genetic genealogy is only going to give you results of people that you have common DNA with. And that's really important to know. So that's only people that you have common DNA. So because of the way the X chromosome and the Y chromosome travel differently in time, you can have a first cousin, but have different DNA type results. So I think both are really quite useful. The genetic genealogy has been used, scientists have used it. It really became popular back in the 90s when, for the first time, the scientists were able, and historians were really able to identify the remains of the family of the Russian Tsar. And definitively to say that the remains that they found were from that family. I think the other famous one is identifying that Thomas Jefferson had children with someone who was a slave on his plantation. And that was all through genetic, that would be called genetic DNA and the DNA, pardon me, and the genetic results. But for those folks who were not claimed as Thomas Jefferson's family, they might not have appeared in the traditional family tree. I'm sure they didn't appear in the traditional family tree. So to get a complete picture, you've really got to use different kinds of resources at different times. I'm going to go back now and talk about some guidelines. So
real quick, Marge,
whatever site you use.
One second. I see that Miriam has a hand raised, so maybe a question.
Yeah, Miriam, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to see if we could also, just to have everyone participate along a little bit, if there's a site that they can go on now as you're talking about this, so they can really, figure it out as you're teaching this, right? So
sure, go ahead.
Would that be the family? Was that the family? I'm looking at it. The family search. Would that be the best place? In other words, for them to look at now, if they wanted to start with the family search.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Familysearch.org. Yep. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Just kind of work through it. And I also didn't know if you wanted to just take a pause. I hope I'm not throwing you off, Marge. Just to get, if people want to even just go around and give a little history about, where they're from and where they've already been in their journeys. If you don't mind, Marge, just to take a minute to get some background.
Sure. Do you want to start?
Oh God, that's putting us up. My brother's the ancestry buff in my family, so I go to him, and he's been putting stuff together. And I forget which site he uses because he ended up importing it and making some site for all the Wartels. This is not a common. So he also does stuff on my mom's side too, but especially on my dad's side.
Did he really? Yeah.
But you know, Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian. That's my history, and I leave all the heavy lifting to my brother. And Sam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you. And Marge, great job. I'm really grateful for this. When I came up, and you can tell by the white hair, that was a long time ago, we really did not get into this kind of thing. I have one interesting anecdote, and then building on your comment regarding understanding context.
Yeah.
When I was in the Army, I met my first wife. I'm an Illinois farm boy Protestant. My first wife was Jewish, Russian, Ukrainian background. And when we met, she said, Waltz, what's your nationality? And I said, American. She said, no, where's your family from? I said, oh, Illinois. And I had zero sense of ethnicity,
Yeah.
Marge, as you described. And I did not realize until decades later in that context why that following World War I, the anti-German bias in America was very much like the anti-Japanese bias in World War II. And that whole generation of Midwestern people of German ethnicity,
Yes.
that was squeezed out of us. I had no idea of growing up with that kind of a German background. So
That's interesting. Yes.
my Waltz family goes back to the 1790s, immigrating from Bavaria. And on my mother's side, we trace it back to the 1600s, the Davis family in colonial Virginia.
Interesting. And what have you used to search?
I used actually one of the very interesting ones is findagrave.com.
Oh, yes.
Find a grave is very, very helpful. And I actually visited the hometown on the Ohio River, VV, Indiana, where the Waltz family settled in the 1790s. But
Wow.
Find a Grave is a great resource.
Yes, it is. Yep. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
And Bob was saying, so interested in what you were saying. He wanted you to continue. I just wanted to have everyone take maybe just 30 seconds. So maybe we'll just have everyone just do a literal 30 seconds. And then Marge, how are you time-wise?
I'm
So I don't know.
fine. We're fine.
Okay. I just want to make sure that you're able to get through what you wanted to.
I am. We're fine. We're good.
Janine, you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I've already talked to Marge about genealogy, but I'm really excited to hear what you said. So I started doing this. I've always been interested. I love history, and I've always been interested and had little family stories. And then I don't know, a couple of years ago, I started, sort of down the ancestry rat hole. And oh my God, I really
Yes.
like I was really one of those people that really got into it and just had to like tell myself I was going to give myself only 3 hours today, and then I had to go back to work. So it's fascinating to me. I found out all kinds of stuff. I've mostly done ancestry, but you're reminding me to get on Family Search, which I am on. But I was finding that everything I found someplace else, somebody had already posted on Ancestry. So anyway, and I think I'm at the stage where I know where my blocks are, figuring out how to go about trying to like go one generation further is where I am. And I think the other thing is that trying to be aware of, how to verify what you're learning. So a lot of things are open source, right? Anybody can write anything. And so I have absolutely come across stuff that I have been able to kind of dismiss. I know it's not true. Somebody's gone the wrong way or they've got false information, but how you figure out, how you look at like who entered the information and how they knew it was right,
Yes.
whether they did or not.
Yes.
Anyway, so I'm glad we're doing this. Thank you, Marge.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah. Michael, you want to jump in quickly?
Sure. I think I'm related to Miriam. or at least her brother, pretty much the same kind of background. What kind of problems are there in trying to identify data and resources going back in Europe prior to the Holocaust? Is the data there? Is there some other way to do it? Or
you will find online, there are many specific resources available for different countries. And so it all depends on what survived, and it all depends on, yes, what was lost during the Holocaust. The other thing, between World War I and World War II, you had a lot of country boundaries change, right? So, what maybe used to be a part of Austria is now a part of Poland, then became a part of somewhere else, and then it shifted back again. That was a pretty turbulent time for Eastern Europe, especially in terms of the country boundaries. So that can also be a challenge. So for example, my husband's family, they are on both sides, his mother's side and his father's side, they are Eastern European Jews. My husband always thought that on his paternal side, it was all Russian. And on his mother's side, it was a combination of Austria and Poland. However, now what his brother is finding is that they're all from Kiev, which is now a part of Ukraine. So Brian's sitting here scratching his head saying, so what am I? What is my ethnicity? So it can be extra challenging. I would again go back to the Holocaust Museum down in DC and/or other libraries that have specific collections dedicated to that time period in history. Like I said, Stockton University can be helpful. You can even get somebody on the phone and talk to them. I'm really remiss in not saying too that librarians are wonderful sources of information. Any library that has an archive, they can be really, really helpful. The other challenges, which you bring up, just an interesting question, period. If you're Native American, it can be very hard to trace that. And that's where family stories also become really important. If you are Black and have been in this country for a long time and your ancestors were enslaved and are a part, they've been erased. There were not names. It might just be listed on a census that there was, one slave in the family, in the household. Or more disturbingly, it's, listed as property, right? So, and names are really, really important. And that's something I wanted to talk about too. I will share, just to go back to the conversation too about Germans, and being from Germany was not very popular for a long time. My mother's family goes back to Wisconsin 1700s, and they are from Germany, and they came over through England. But that was also very minimized. We had that experience in my family as well. Yet there is a giant binder, and it's now been populated online by one of my mother's cousins. But anyway, so to the conversation and the comment about verifying, if something doesn't look right, you always want to check different kinds of records against each other. And I'll talk about that in a second. I was going to talk about that with number 3, the discrepancies and how you can attempt to reconcile. Are there other comments before I go on?
Bob, did you want to jump in and give a quick 30-second?
No, Marge is doing a terrific job. Really interested to hear more, and I just share your frustration in terms of legibility or illegibility of census records.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Darshan, Baron, do you guys, I don't know if you're by the computer or not right now, do you guys want to jump in?
Nothing to add right now. Just been watching. It's a little overwhelming, to be honest. That's kind of cool.
I will tell you that when I took the genealogy course up at BU, I hated it. I was miserable. It was 8 weeks of misery. And but I miss it. I love it, and I will go back and complete the certification. But yes, especially when each week we were given a different name and told to search, and then we had to answer specific questions. It was really hard. It's very difficult. So
What I found particularly interesting is things like ancestry.com. I'm an attorney who deals with privacy law, and I'm also in the life sciences. And one of the interesting things is how ancestry.com and 23andMe were selling data. So I avoid using any of those services because I just don't want a central database that's tracking me and my family. And it obviously has its value, it has its uses, but I just thought it was interesting.
Well, right. And I think it has a mixed reputation as well, because you'll get these notices that you're related to someone terribly famous, right?
Right.
But it's not necessarily why you're interested in learning more about your family background.
Right.
And how much does it really mean? I don't know, one time I got a notice that I was like, I don't know, some many generations removed from someone famous. And it was like, okay, but I'm much more interested in the ones with a closer DNA match, or the ones that are what I would call more normal people that, I could relate to in life in some way. And that's why I distinguish between traditional genealogy and the genetic genealogy, because who we count as family are the people that we go through the years with, and the people that we celebrate momentous occasions with, weddings and funerals and all those sorts of things. So,
I have one more question / comment. I've always heard that Southeast Asian genealogy is terribly underrepresented when you do these types of searches. So it's one of those reasons where I'm going, why would I go out there and put my information out there when I know that I'm not going to get anything back? Have you heard that pushback much, or is that all just rumors?
I have heard that, yes. And I think, and I'm sitting here trying to think, I haven't actually even encountered an alternate resource to suggest. If I find one, because I'm forever fascinated by this, I will let you know.
I appreciate that.
I think you and I are on the life sciences subgroup together.
Right.
So,
Yep, we are.
Yeah. But yeah, Southeast Asia, it's very, and that's the other thing. And this is, again, historical context matters. So, politics, world politics, this is what I was going to talk about. The other thing under historical context matters is what, the United States history in relation to immigration is very mixed, right? You had the Chinese Exclusion Act. You had, after unsettling world events, our country can have passed laws, either barring or limiting the number of immigrants that can come from a certain area, or making it really difficult. So all of that's really important to keep in mind. And I mention these things because these are the places where people get really frustrated, because they're finding results that don't necessarily reconcile with other results that they found. So that's very tough. One of the best ways is to start with a research question versus just a name. So if you plug in a name, you want to at least plug in some dates, a location, some geography. Dates are really important, because otherwise, especially if you're on FamilySearch.org, you can come up with hundreds of thousands of hits, and you don't want to just sit there and scroll through all of this. So the way Family Search works is it gives you different ways that you can customize your search. It's all a drop-down menu, and you can add or subtract different fields that you want to have factored in. And that can be really helpful. But starting with a research question like, where, so I know my dad lived in Philadelphia, or I know my grandparents came over sometime between 1910 and 1920. So I'm going to search the 1910 census to see if I can find where they were and who they were living with, because I know they came over to live with other family members, and I want to know who those family members are. And so I searched the 1910 census, and then I searched the 1920 census. And in 1910, I could only find my grandfather. He came over first, would seem to be the answer. And then in 1920, I found my grandparents together in the same house with the same last name. And I found, some of my father's siblings who had been born. But what I also found that was really interesting was, so when you go, so census forms are yay long with lots of columns. And from decade to decade, the questions that are asked may be different. And that's the other interesting thing. So you may get different detail. But everything I'm finding about my paternal grandmother lists her place of birth as Scotland. Yet when we went to Northern Ireland, we thought we were reading her baptism record at a church in Northern Ireland. So I still haven't figured that one out. And I have since gone back to Northern Ireland and talked to family there, and they just say to me, no, that's wrong. A lot of people from Northern Ireland left and traveled over from Scotland. So that must be what it is. But there are so many US documents that list birthplace Scotland that I have to believe there's something there. So anyway, you want to use a log to keep track of where you've been. I don't know, Janine, if you've done this. I know you've hit a block.
No, but I have a notebook, and I'm not very disciplined about using a log, but it's a good idea.
It does help, just because, like you said, you can, before you know it, hours have gone by.
Yeah.
And you can find yourself getting caught in loops.
Right.
I mean, I've done that, and it's very frustrating. Professional genealogists, if you were to hire one, they are bound by something called the genealogical proof standard. And there's 5 components to it. And it would answer a part of your question, Janine, as well. They have to prove in 5 different ways that the results that they're reporting to you are accurate. So there's 5 different tests that any results, that's what they consider as like the standard, that the result is accurate, is these 5 different ways. So 5 different search records. And again, there's so many different kinds of records that can be searched. One thing to note in terms of, if many of us are from, we are at some point, we immigrated here. Names, it's a common misconception that names were changed when people arrived here on these shores. The people, the official immigration officials, all they were tasked with doing was making sure that the arriving ship and the people coming through, that it matched the passenger manifest that they were given from the point of departure. And so that was how they matched your records. A lot of people changed their own names for a variety of reasons. Most commonly, it was because they needed to find work. So the simplest name could sometimes make it much easier for them to get work, especially if they were not necessarily skilled and they were, you
Mhm.
know, in a line, you know, waiting to be called up to work one day. It would be a lot easier to say Smith than to say a last name that has multiple syllables. So, you know, a lot of people change their names on their own, and it could be immigrants, as we all know, can be very, very practical people. They have to be. You know, it's about survival at first, and it's about getting income and shelter and food. So it can come from a very practical place. The other thing that you'll see on census records is nicknames versus proper names. So, for instance, my name is Margaret, my official name. I was named after my paternal grandmother. She was Margaret. Well, she was called Maggie, and that's what's on the census record. My other cousin who was named after her is called Peggy, and that's what's on her, you know, when I find census records with her listed. And then there's me, who, and I go by Marge. So the other thing, and this goes especially to different cultures, different ethnicities, you may not know what common nicknames might have been.
Mhm.
It's also really true for Jewish immigrants, where Yiddish is the primary language spoken in the home, which you'll see on the census record. Sometimes it's just in the pronunciation or something, or the spelling of something, but that can change things. And in my class, there was a big debate about Yiddish. So for any of you who have Jewish roots, and identify as Jewish, and your relatives identify as Jewish, you can find a lot of Jewish genealogy discussion forums and articles about the use of Yiddish and how it may affect records. It's pretty interesting, actually. And there was a big debate in my class, all online. I'd never seen so much posted on this one board. You're going to find direct evidence, so such as when you're looking at the birth certificate, the official birth certificate. That would be an example of direct evidence. That's one and done. Indirect evidence could be where you find a marriage certificate, and then you also find some you might find some real estate records. Maybe neither is clear in and of themselves. Maybe like a name is spelled slightly differently, or a date is a little bit off. You know, whether someone was married in 1890, or maybe it was, I don't know, 1880, and it's a function of handwriting. But then you find a real estate record of some sort, and maybe from that the writing is clearer, and so then you can say, oh, okay, I know that as of 1890 they were a married couple, you know. So indirect evidence is when you need multiple sources to get to a correct answer, and you need multiple sources to confirm something that you've found. And then negative evidence is when you think you know something, but you can't find evidence to support it. So maybe it's a family story that, you know, your grandmother lived at, I don't know, 9th and Spruce, but you can find no evidence of that. And you've checked different census records, you've checked death records, which a death certificate always has the address on it. And you can't find, there's nothing else, there's just literally nothing to support that your grandmother lived at 9th and Spruce. And so, yes, that gets to the whole verifying and testing question. And again, the Fields standard is 5 different ways that you prove that that evidence that you found is accurate. So you can replicate that 5 different ways.
Wait, so Marge, this is Janine. So what if you don't have 5 different ways? I mean, what if it doesn't exist?
Well,
So for,
right.
go ahead.
Yeah, it may not exist. And so you have to then leave room that you have enough, right? You're satisfied, you have enough, and you have enough context and knowledge that it's accurate. You know, but then on your log, you can also note that, right? I think of family trees as also some, you know, that they can have errors. They can, when I was preparing for this, I was looking up a family tree, you know, one branch of a family tree. And for the first time, it occurred to me something that's on there, just there's no way it can be accurate. It's just, you know, it's so, you know, I think for us amateur genealogists,
Yeah.
you know, 2 or 3 sources is good.
Yeah. Well, I will just say for everybody else, if you have done your DNA, I actually, so I have answered one question through DNA where there was somebody who was the last child of somebody, and I really questioned it. And so sometimes is listed as a, you know, offspring of this particular person, and sometimes not, because there were a lot of children. And so I had a real question of, you know, is this right or not? Am I with the right? This was, their name was Jackson. I was like, maybe they're a different Jackson family, but I was able to look, because if you stay on Ancestry, it shows you all your matches and their trees. And I could see all these other people, you know, with a tree of siblings of that person. And so that, for me, I broke, I mean, I think that is one of the places where the DNA actually helped me kind of verify, like, yes, this is the right group of people.
Absolutely.
There's just too many people I share DNA with that family for it not to be that this person has got to be a part of that family.
Yeah.
So that was,
yeah. I was just going to say, I like doing the combination of Ancestry and with Darshan, I know what you've said, and there is a certain gimmickiness at times to you know, to Ancestry and 23andMe. But it does do the genetic testing, and that is useful, but there is a privacy issue there. So, so that's a personal choice. And then again, like we already talked about, and I'm so grateful you guys mentioned it, the historical context matters so much. There's so much to know. So it does help to have a love of history. So that's really all I wanted to talk about. I've only got, well, we've got 5 minutes left for questions. I want to be respectful of your time. Miriam, thank you. I should have said something at the beginning of the talk about people jumping in. So I appreciate your prompt.
Yeah.
I just kind of went right into it. You know, if we were to do this again, I would love to be able to do like a demo.
yeah.
You know, so that because the records piece is really, really useful. And I personally find the records piece really fascinating. Yeah, there is a magnifier tool on it, but sometimes even with that, it can still be hard to read, but I do find it really helpful. Anyway, so I'll stop now. And are there any final comments or questions?
I think you did a great job, Marge. Just wanted to throw that out there. I think it was very informative and very much well organized and well explained. So Sam, you want to jump in?
Sure. You know, I thought, Marge, thank you. Wonderful job. Serendipity helps, and being forward with name and ethnicity helps. It occurs to me about 20 years ago, I was helping a young woman, she was from Allentown and Jewish. I've forgotten her name. And I took her to an event with me, and there she met a friend of mine named Henry Beckler, who had helped open up credit card banking here in Wilmington, Delaware 40 years ago. Interestingly, her maiden name was Beckler, and her grandfather and Henry's father had been brothers, and there had been a feud in the family, and her grandfather went to Texas, and the families had been out of touch and lost each other. And out of my introduction of her to my friend Henry, who is now deceased, the two branches of the family reestablished contact.
I love
Wow.
that.
That's neat. That's neat.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend, he's of Spanish descent. And all these years, he was raised Catholic, and as far as he knew, he was Catholic. Well, no, turns out he's Jewish. And
Hmm.
during the Spanish Inquisition, talk about erasing records and erasing family history. And he only recently, I think he's 70 now, only recently discovered that he is in fact Jewish. So yeah, there's all sorts of things. Yeah, yes, talking to other people is so helpful, and you can learn so much, and sharing resources. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? All right.
Well, can I ask, since we have 2 minutes, I'm gonna ask a question. I have a million questions. Well, okay. So Marge, one thing I haven't done, and I haven't figured out how to do it, is to research the places, which I don't really know how to do. So your family had a farm somewhere or a property somewhere. I mean,
Yeah.
all our families had farms. Almost everybody was a farmer at some point.
Yeah.
How do you, I mean, can you do that online, or do you really have to like go to the county office and, pull the records and?
You can do it online, but only to a point. I found, and Sam mentioned this, Find a Grave is very useful.
Yeah.
That's really a useful site for many.
Mhm.
Serendipity is a big piece of it, but yeah, sometimes you have to get out of your house
Yeah.
and go to.
You have to go to the office. Yeah.
You really do. But and with that, the other thing is a caution is to call and try to talk to somebody first,
Mhm.
to make sure you can access things, and when you can
Right.
access things.
Because if you have the census record after 1850, well, actually maybe before, but it tells you the address where those people are. So you have something to work with. And I don't know. I have one set of family, the census record, they're all kind of together at different addresses. And it's like, I need to see this physical. Are they basically on a big farm with like 3 houses, and it's just where,
Right.
they're all mixed up. And it's,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like the families aren't together. And I thought, yeah, but the census worker walked around at, 10 in the morning, and maybe all the kids were at one house. And so,
Absolutely.
that's, it's like, I need to see where he was. Anyway.
That's also a really good point, and I'll just mention this really, really quick. You just reminded me. But people often immigrate in groups of some sort, and maybe it's with friends, or maybe it's with a cousin or an aunt, or so that's the other place where census records are really useful. So I can see that when my paternal grandmother came to this country, she went and lived with someone that I was able to find that my paternal grandfather came over with before her. And so a picture, a story and a picture begins to develop. But people tend to come together when they're immigrants, and they tend to land together. Maybe it's the same street in Philadelphia.
Right.
Or like you're saying, in farming communities. Yeah. I have that in Wisconsin because I'm not really familiar enough. And again, things have changed from the 1700s as well.
Right.
So anyhow, so I could go on and on. I will stop.
Thank you, Marge. This was awesome.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Miriam, for asking. I do enjoy talking about this stuff.
I knew people would love it. So, it's the most relatable topic,
Yeah.
We could do it again. It would be fun.
Yeah. So I have my contact information if I can ever help. And Darshan, I will I will, actually, I'm gonna email my one professor from BU a very good question. And I did think about this morning that there are some real missing groups.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.